Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, the most racist book I have ever read, Dragonard by Rupert Gilchrist. This video is really going to be about two things. Firstly, it will be a review of the book Dragonard by Rupert Gilchrist. Secondly, it will be a bit of a discussion about problematic books. What are problematic books? Why are they problematic? And why would I choose to read them? And why might you choose to read them too? And, you know, I will be very open about this. I knew when I went into reading Dragonard that it was going to be a very racist book, and I chose to read it anyway. So I'll talk about why that was in this video. But firstly, let me do a bit of a review of the book. So this is a book that came out in the 1970s. And it's about an English guy called Richard Abdy who goes to St Kitts, an island in the Caribbean, and makes a life for himself there. So it's kind of a rags to riches story. Now, the way he makes a life for himself there, and this book is set, I think, in the 1800s, is by becoming part of the slave trade. So initially, when he moves over there, he gets a job as a slave master. So his job is to punish slaves who are perceived to have done something wrong. And there are some extensive scenes of him whipping black slaves at the start of the book. As the plot of the book progresses, and I won't tell you too much because it would spoil it, but as the plot of the book progresses, through various means, he manages to come into more and more money and builds a successful life for himself. And this book is the first in a series of books. I think there's 6 overall that follow his journey. So it's a fairly typical kind of like popular novel trope from the 60s and 70s, this kind of rags to riches, and probably older than 60s and 70s actually, but this rags to riches story of how someone who is very determined manages to make more and more money and become more and more successful, and the impact that has on them and on the people around them. Now, clearly, one of the things that's different about this book is that he makes his money through slavery, through doing absolutely horrific things to other human beings. And one of the things that is very striking about the book, and one of the reasons why I say it is the most racist book I've ever read, is that the black characters in this book, of whom there are many, are typically not really represented as being human. There are many bits of dialogue where people, like white characters, use the word human to mean white people rather than people more generally. But just generally speaking, a lot of the descriptions of the black characters dehumanize them. They are described in the same way that you might describe animals rather than the way you would normally describe people. Now, there is one black character in the book, a female character, who that isn't true for. She is like a fully fleshed out character. She's one of the more interesting characters in the book, and she is also the one character in the book who feels like someone who can stand up to Richard Abdy, like an equal of his. So that I thought was quite interesting. But generally speaking, the black characters in this book are treated appallingly, both by the white characters and by the author. So that gives you a sense of the plot. But the plot really is just there to give the author an excuse, a channel, if you like, to present to the reader scene after scene of sex and violence. So there is a huge amount of violence in this book, quite often very graphic, and typically violence from white characters against black characters. And there is also a huge amount of sex in this book. It covers a wide range of sexual activity, some of it deeply shocking, some of it more traditionally titillating, shall we say, but some of it is really out there and unpleasant. So this is a book that is intensely sleazy, but it presents itself as a quote unquote historical novel. It's basically a book that pretends that it is presenting these things to you because it wants to give you a frank account of what life used to be like, but it does it in a way which is purely there to titillate and entertain the reader, I think, rather than trying to make a deeper point about the nature of humanity or anything like that. So what we have then is a book that is deeply trashy and quite offensive in a number of different ways, both in terms of its politics, but also in terms of its just repeated use of sex and violence to excite the reader. What I think is interesting now, and what I want to move on to talking about now, is the context in which this book was published, because this I think is quite interesting. So from the way I've described the book, a deeply sleazy, deeply problematic, deeply racist book, you might expect that it didn't come from a mainstream publisher. Now clearly this was published some time ago, in the 1970s, so around 50 years ago, but actually it came from two mainstream publishers. So in the US it was published by Bantam, and in the UK it was published by Corgi, so two of the really big paperback publishers of the day. And it was also filmed, so it was filmed quite a bit later, in I think 1987 or 1988. There was a film version that came out, which had some reasonably big names in it. So it had Oliver Reed and Eartha Kitt in it. So this is something that was broadly acceptable at the time. It wasn't beyond the pale. The other thing that's quite interesting is the biography of the writer. So if you Google Rupert Gilchrist, you will find nothing about him at all. And reading this biography, I think we can figure out why. So the biography says, Rupert Gilchrist was born 32 years ago on the Leeward Isle of Nevis, the 7th generation of an English colonial family. Mr. Gilchrist is the first to break away from plantation life. After attending preparatory school in Rhode Island, he studied on the continent, then travelling extensively in Africa and the Far East, he returned home when he first came up with the idea for the Dragonard trilogy. Gilchrist now lives in Montserrat in a 17th century captain's house which he faithfully restored himself. His hobbies include horses, skin diving, collecting African artefacts and tuning the engine of his Lamborghini. So I think it's fair to say that Rupert Gilchrist is probably not a real person, that this is a pseudonym. And I suspect that quite possibly the publisher, an editor at the publisher, came up with the idea for this series of books and recruited a writer to write them. I don't know who that writer actually was, but what I would say is, despite all the horrific things about these books that I've mentioned, they are actually very readable and very gripping. He definitely, whoever he or she was, knows how to tell a story. And I was gripped by these books whilst being appalled by them. I kept on turning the pages to see what horrific thing would happen next, but also to see what would happen to the characters. So Richard Abdey, the central character, is utterly detestable. And because of that, whilst you don't care for him in the same way that you might care for a character you like in a book, you want to know what happens to him. You want to know what awful thing he's going to do next and whether he is ever going to get his comeuppance. So the books are tremendously, or this book anyway, is tremendously readable despite all of those flaws. So why would a publisher recruit someone to write a series of books like this? Clearly they thought they were going to be popular. And I think this taps into a kind of reactionary trend at the time. So as I said, this book came out in the 1970s. So following on, if you think about, what had been going on around race relations in the US, you had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. You then had kind of the rise of the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s. And the rise of kind of black media, if you like, so books and blaxploitation movies in particular, starting to break into the mainstream in the 70s. And I think there was a portion of white society in both America and the UK that were deeply, deeply troubled by that felt threatened by that. And I think books like this are a reaction to that. And this is not a standalone. This is part of the quote unquote plantation genre of books, which starts really with Gone with the Wind. But there was a really big book in I think it was written in either the 50s or the 60s, Mandingo, and then many other books of this type, and even pulpier, trashier ones than this, that came out particularly in the 1970s as, people in white society, not all of them by any means, but many of them struggled with this greater visibility and representation for black people. So I think books like this in some ways kind of act as wish fulfillment for people who feel themselves threatened by the progress in society, who feel that their identity is threatened by the fact that society is changing around them, to harken back to earlier times when maybe the group that they are from had more power in society. And certainly the white characters in this book have far more power than the black characters. So whilst I certainly don't applaud that need to look backwards, I do think that it is a genuine thing for some people, and that publishers know that and that publishers cash in on it. So why then would I, as someone who doesn't want to harken back to that kind of past, want to read a book like this? Why did I read this book even though I knew that it was going to be really, really racist? Well, the answer is kind of similar to the reasons I read disturbing books. I think it's interesting to look at the really horrible side of humanity. And in this case, I mean not necessarily just the fact that the slave trade existed, because I don't think that this is really an accurate representation of the slave trade, and it definitely doesn't give you insight into the experience of the black characters, only the white characters. So it's not a book I would recommend reading for its historical accuracy. It's more the fact that this book was sold 50 years ago as entertainment, and I find that fascinating. I find it really interesting to think about the way society changes and the way society reacts, the way portions of society react to changes in the wider society, as I've talked about in this video. I find that stuff really, really interesting. And it's also interesting to stare at something that is as boldly racist as this book is, and compare that to your own values. And this feels relevant in 2025 as well, in terms of the fact that whilst entertainment has progressed a lot over the last 50 years in terms of the representation of different groups, that is something that seems to be stalling at the moment. There seems to be this movement in the US in particular to move back from that kind of more representative form of entertainment and back to maybe the kind of entertainment that we saw before the 70s that was predominantly white. So the final question I think then that I want to answer is it okay to read racist books? Is it okay to read a book like this? And that's a really complicated question to answer, and it's one that I think individuals need to make up their own minds about. My personal view is that yes, it is okay to read racist books, but it's not okay to be racist. And I also would say that I wouldn't support an author who was writing today, who was publishing new books that were, as blatantly racist as something like this is. I think sometimes people in the bookish community have a tendency to try and find, bigotry in books, to elevate like small things in books and present them as being in some way problematic. And that may not always be the case. Now, this book, I don't think anyone could argue that this book is deeply, deeply racist. And if this book was published today, I would not be handing over my money to support the author. But this book came out 50 years ago. I bought a second-hand copy of it, and I don't have a problem with that at all. But to expand that thought a little bit, so I've just said that I think there are occasions when people in the bookish community make more of small details in books than maybe is necessary. And I've certainly been guilty of doing that myself in the past. The other thing I've been guilty of doing in the past is the flip side of that, and that is to excuse racism or other forms of bigotry in books because they were of their time. So, to say that because a book was published 100 years ago, it's understandable that it is racist. Now, I get that to an extent. I think, and I've tried to do this in this video, I've tried to explain why it was okay for a big publisher like Corgi or Bantam to publish this book, to publish Dragonard, a clearly racist book, why it was considered okay at the time in the mid-1970s for them to do this. So I think it explains the racism in the book, but it doesn't excuse it. My view is if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, let's call it a duck. Dragonard is that duck. Dragonard is a very racist book, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that it's a racist book. Just because that racism may have been more acceptable 50 years ago doesn't mean that we shouldn't call it out. So those are my thoughts on a book you probably never heard of before and probably still don't want to read, but do let me know what you think of the discussion in the comments. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.